Thinking about all the gaslighting going on, wondering if parliamentary procedure, public domain, the sixth estate of social media, and the official opposition still have a constructive purpose. Pause, think about it with intentional thought, and consider where we go from here. Stay tuned and hear what Ben McKinney got to say about what these instruments of communications seem to be in terms of our national development.
Something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles. What we think, we become. What we radiate, we attract. What we imagine, we surely can achieve. Let's change the narrative, 242.
Welcome to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles. And here this evening we have this honorable fellow in front of us who's going to be talking to us about some really, really, really important things that define us as a society. And hopefully we will find a way to tap into those things and make sure that they come to be material in their workings throughout our various activities on a day-to-day basis, so we could build this country to higher heights and become great, 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 great than anybody else has ever dreamed that we can be. Welcome, Mr. Benjamin McKinney. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing well, and thank you for the invite. As we were talking for a minute off screen, I was telling you that what you're doing is so important. It is preparing us to move the country forward. There are many ways that we can do that, and this is one of them in terms of educating and informing Bahamians of their rights and of having some public discussion. And so I think what you're doing is great, and you have my full support with it.
Thank you kindly. That's plenty of support. Don't mind the structure, the stature, because so all our great men in the Bahamas are small in stature for some strange reason. I don't know. That's the numbers. People could find a way to translate that into the numbers, but yeah, they get some bearing to that somehow. And great things coming from you, and coming, and not just now, but I mean coming, because the good Lord paving a way for you that I believe there's going to be some massive things going to happen when people start to feel your fingertips touching them all over the place.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, and I received that.
Great. But tell our people why I say all those good things about you. Tell them a little bit about yourself. I know you have a lot of history and you're into history, but tell them a little bit just so they get a capsule of who Ben McKinney is. And by the way, which do you prefer to be called today?
Either is fine, but
Okay.
perhaps Ben would be more conducive or more convenient, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
So starting out, I grew up in Freeport, our nation's second city, and after studying in the U.S. For a couple of years, I was studying business administration. And one of the courses that was a prerequisite was business law. And so I'd always had an interest in law and in history, social studies, those type of subjects. But that kind of opened up my eyes, in a sense, in terms of rather than some career in business or banking, this introduction to law is where I realized that my future lied. So obviously with a lot of Bahamians, unfortunately, finances is a major factor. And I came home, worked for a number of years and saved, and eventually was able to save up sufficient monies for what I thought would be enough to go to the UK and pursue my law studies there. But unfortunately, at the time, where the pound was so strong, it was almost $2 for £1. Right. And so you can imagine how quickly that money just eroded.
Yep.
Yeah. So after 2 years, I was fortunate enough to get a job with the Bahamas Maritime Authority. And I switched my studies from full time to part time, switched the visa over from a student visa to a work visa,
Right.
and then just got into working and living in the UK. Finished off the law degree, and then I did the same in terms of the bar course and did that part time while I worked full time. And it's during those 5 years that I really got a good grasp of what maritime law is. And I've been practicing that in the UK for about the last 15 years, but with the flexibility that we have. So, for example, you're in your home and I'm in mine,
Right.
and we're able to communicate. So, I was able to, through the pandemic and post pandemic, to keep that going and juggling my time between Nassau and London. But that's the gist of my history.
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
this thing that we're talking about, I'll give you a little story about why I think what you're doing is so important. Because my first semester in law school, they threw us right into the mix of it, constitutional and administrative law.
Okay.
And I couldn't understand this for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I noted that those who look like us, so those students who were
Mm-hmm.
from predominantly black and brown countries, and when I say
Right.
brown, I'm talking about Pakistan, Bangladesh,
Right.
other Commonwealth countries, we had a hard time grasping these concepts when the white students didn't.
Right.
And it's something that puzzled me. And our tutor at the time said, you have to understand this. You cannot be a lawyer if you don't understand these concepts. So that caused us to just double down
Mm-hmm.
on the studies. But I had always said to myself, when I get home, I don't want any other Bahamian to be in the situation where I found myself.
Right.
So these what we call first world countries, from in junior high or in high school, they are teaching their students about these things, human rights, constitution, and other things, when predominantly we don't. And so it's more of a education and an information campaign that we have to
Right.
go on. Ideally, it should be led by the government, but it hasn't as yet. Hopefully, that's something that is in the works. But in the meantime, this thing that you're doing, you and others, I think it's so important as we just passed our first 50th anniversary, and we're now
Mm-hmm.
laying the foundation for our second. It's so important that everybody knows what their rights are and that we have a more informed citizenry.
Right. Yes. That's awesome to know because just to put a little snippet to that, um the reason I am doing the show, or one of the reasons why I'm doing the show, besides it being DNA of me, is that um I found that a lot of people didn't know the Constitution or never even read it. And so I had this view of to do a conjunction junction was your function type ABC schools rock thing with our Constitution using Junkanoo characters, etc., music to teach our Constitution. And I went to some people to get it done, but they kept pushing back because I figured they the ones who knew the Constitution inside out. If I was to put my face, nobody knew who it was. You know how people go. We only follow the Macamaks and so forth.
Yes.
And so they
Yeah.
tell me, do it yourself, do it yourself. And I stench for about 5 to 10 years. And then somehow Michael Diggers got me in the radio. And then I said, well, you know what? When that's finished, I came over and started doing this and tried to build on that concept, which was great. But I know you, Ben. You very modest in a lot of ways. In some ways not, um, but I know you to be very thought diligent and a professional, and as an individual, in almost everything you do, or however you walk, you prepare well. You go in detail for whatever the cause is, and so forth. But I mean, there's a little mischievousness in there somewhere that you always throw in there in the mix, particularly on social media, and you found a way to use that to help advance or leverage social media so that you could get the message across also to help build the nation. And that's what kind of attracted me um, to your social media posts, etc. Is because
Right.
you weren't
Yeah.
just being the person out there who just ranting, raving, and rallying and all that kind of stuff. You were trying to build people's minds. And I found that very much in alignment with what Something to Think About is all about. So I take my hat off for you for that. And, hopefully we will be able to build this new built environment that I keep talking about and get that $100 billion economy in the next 5 to 10 years with so
Right.
forth. Good.
Yeah.
But Bernard Halsdane said that if you want to get the best out of people, out of a person, you must look for the best in that person.
Okay.
And so when we have this conversation tonight, I want us to look at it from that perspective also. And so, because I want to know, is our nation looking for the best of its people? And so we want to tap into the parliamentary privilege issue. We want to tap into the opposition role, and all these things, the sixth estate, what I call the social media, and all these things to find out, are people actually using these instruments of communications the way they were designed and intended to. You talked about when you were in school in London, how the children over there understood and we didn't. Because obviously there's some disconnect, and we have to make that connection so that we use these instruments correctly or change the instruments and use something else.
Right. Exactly. And so one thing that you raised in terms of the issue of parliamentary privilege, for example, and we had a case a few years ago. This was the case where, at the time, Jerome Fitzgerald was a member of parliament, and he says that he found certain emails in his garbage can, and then read out some, or at least one of the emails, may have been more, but he used his parliamentary privilege to do that. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, and we had a ruling on it. But I think, I don't think it was a right ruling. In these instances, you have to criticize the ruling rather than criticize the judge.
Right, right.
And so you just have to keep it focused on the issue. In this instance, the issue is, what is parliamentary privilege, and how does it relate to freedom of speech, and what role do our legislators, our MPs, and our senators have with this? And
Yeah.
so,
So before you get into too deep into that, just give our listeners, they've heard it before from the Honorable Officer Roku was on the show, actually when I was on another show, but anyway, and a couple of others, and we talked about the Constitution from different levels, but just from a high level point of view, where we talk about the Constitution preamble, talks about recognizing the preservation of our freedoms and the guarantee the national commitment, self-discipline, industry, loyalty, unity, and abiding respect for Christian values and the rule of law.
right. Yeah.
But we have these branches of government. Just highlight the significance of the branches and why they are considered sovereign. Yeah.
And
So
and
people
so
get a concept as to why you do say about privilege. Yeah.
Yeah. So this same point that you are talking about, this is one thing that I fully didn't understand, and I would dare say some of my classmates from um, Asian and African countries, because when I grew up in the 70s and the early 80s, the prime minister was all powerful, and to imagine a concept of where an average citizen like me or you had certain rights, that if any member of the executive, the prime minister or cabinet minister, breached our rights, we
Right.
would be able to go to the courts and seek redress, and they can possibly quash what this all-powerful prime minister or cabinet minister did. That was a concept that I didn't fully understand, since we didn't have it as
Right.
such in the 70s and
In
80s.
practice. Right.
Yeah. And so our government is split into three co-equal branches. So while we usually think of the prime minister as being quote unquote in charge, or the executive branch, actually the three branches, they are co-equal. So we have the prime minister and the cabinet that makes up the executive branch. They execute what parliament, the laws that parliament has made. So there's the executive, there's the legislative branch, and when there's a dispute between parties, then there's the judicial branch who interprets what parliament has intended. So these three co-equal branches are meant to operate as a check and balance with each other. So we have, for example, when we talk about the prime minister and the executive branch, is cabinet ministers. The Constitution provides that the check and balance between these three co-equal branches is that Parliament, the executive branch, is answerable to
Right.
Parliament, since they're the ones who are carrying out the wishes of Parliament from an administrative or an executive perspective. They are answerable to Parliament. So you would see, for example, if you are watching the BBC, and every Wednesday at 12 p.m., when Parliament is in session, they have what they call PMQs, Prime
Right.
Minister's Questions,
Right.
where the Prime Minister comes to Parliament, and any member, whether it's a backbench government member or it's a opposition member, they have in total it's 30 minutes that PMQs are. But any MP is able to ask the Prime Minister questions on behalf of their party or on their constituency, and he has to answer. There are other ministers who, at different times, come to Parliament and they answer to the MPs. But this is the highlight of anything Wednesday at 12 o'clock, the Prime Minister's questions. So our Constitution has that feature also, that the executive is answerable to the legislative branch. And then, in terms of another check and balance that is built into the system, both the executive and the legislative branch are answerable to the judicial branch. So, if me or you have an issue with whatever a cabinet minister, a decision that they made, we
Right.
can go to the courts, as we spoke about earlier, and seek redress to have that cabinet minister come and answer to the courts of whether they were acting within the law as the law gave them authority to act.
Right.
And then the legislative branch is answerable in this respect to the judicial branch, because we have a constitution that says the supreme law of the Bahamas is the Constitution.
Right.
It is Article 2. And any other law it, that is contrary to the Constitution is null and void to the extent of the inconsistency. So while Parliament is busy making laws every day of the week or every week, they must make laws, however, that are constitutional. And once again, any of us has the right, if it affects us, we have the local standing, or the locus standi, as it is in Latin, that we can go to the courts and we can ask the courts to determine the constitutionality of a particular act of parliament. And if the courts find that it is unconstitutional, that it infringes in some way on what the Constitution clearly says, the courts now can strike that down.
Right. Okay.
So that is how our three branches of government operate, and how there's a built-in check and balance, and how the average citizen is able now to ensure that their rights are not taken advantage of.
Yeah. And when I was in school, one of my professors or teachers back then, I guess you call them in high school, would be uh, the Honorable Carlton E. Francis. And
Mm,
he, in our math class, we really didn't learn math. We learned about the Bahamas and all of these systems and stuff that you talk about, because we were finished with our math in no time. And then we went on to talk about all of this stuff. Whatever you could dream of, he talked to us about. But he's stern man, by the way. But
okay.
kept us focused. But one of the things I remember him saying, or was said in the class whilst we were having one of these discussions, was that the Parliament, which is the Senate and the House Assembly, is for the people, or they represent the people as such, and then the executive is the executors of the people for the people, and they
Right.
are over there on that other branch, and then the judiciary is the crown, who's looking over everybody and making sure everything is governed correctly. Would that be a accurate way of saying it? So people who may not understand would say,
I would agree with that. And in a sense, while we think of a prime minister or cabinet ministers as being all powerful, actually they're answerable to the two other branches.
right,
So the legislative branch, as we discussed earlier, since they're the ones who are making the laws, and so the executive has to answer to them. Are you carrying out the law as we intended? And then to the judicial branch, as we said, that we can go to the courts to seek redress if something is not carried out in a proper way as Parliament intended it. So I think that summarizes the challenge that we have for those of us who haven't had the opportunity to have these principles of democracy in our political system taught to us. We think of it as the prime minister and cabinet being all powerful,
right.
when those from the first world countries, they understand that the power is really in the courts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so whilst we look at that then and transition back to your explanation of parliamentary privilege, um, if we look at the word sovereignty or sovereign, so to me, what that means is that in the space of cabinet or the executive branch itself, and in the space of parliament, those entities or those instruments of the Constitution are sovereign. So if I say something in that space about something in that space, then there's nobody else who could direct what could happen from outside what is said in the space. But like how we have where they say anything said in cabinet is secret, etc. But if you come out of that space and go into the regular general world, then that falls under the preview of the courts to be able to be the ultimate ruler. So we have the speaker, the prime minister, and then you have, I guess, the chief justice, or the supreme. How does that work?
Yeah, Chief
Mm-hmm.
Justice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that, in a nutshell, is what this whole issue of parliamentary privilege is all about. So in Parliament, as you've
Mm-hmm.
said, House of Assembly and the Senate, there is a privilege or a legal immunity for members of either chamber to be able to fully debate and say whatever they think needs to be said without having the fear of saying something, either intentionally or inadvertently, of
Mm-hmm.
saying something where they may end up with a defamation lawsuit, or maybe even worse, we still have criminal libel on our books in terms of a criminal offense. So to remove that and to give members of parliament the freedom to debate and say whatever they think needs to be said, we have this issue of parliamentary privilege. And we spoke briefly about the case that we know about in the last, I think probably about
Yes.
6, 7 years now, when Jerome Fitzgerald used his parliamentary privilege, and we had an adverse ruling against this principle. And so perhaps it may be convenient to not just think of it as a particular MP reading out emails and whether me or you may think that the privacy of someone is more important than the privilege that a parliamentarian has. Perhaps if we go back to the start and we work ourselves forward, I think we can better understand what parliamentary privilege is.
Okay.
And so remember, our parliament, the first session of parliament was in 1729. So we were firmly a colony then. And whatever happened and was precedence regarding the Westminster Conventions and other privileges that Parliament had, since they're the mother of all parliaments, and we are this branch, 1729 now, and we have opened this Bahamas Parliament, whatever was applicable regarding Westminster Conventions automatically became applicable regarding members and MPs and senators in the Bahamas in 1729. So it wasn't anything that needed to be done from a constitutional perspective. It is, we follow the Westminster system of government. And once Westminster has certain conventions and we've opened up ourselves as having a Bahamas Parliament, those Westminster conventions are automatically applicable in terms of how our parliament ought to run.
Right.
And so that's the starting point for us in terms of when we open as a parliament and how did we get parliamentary privilege. And so with 1729 being our starting point from the Bahamas, we go back then 40 years before that in 1689. And I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the Bill of Rights. But in the Bill of Rights in the UK, 40 years before we ever had a Bahamas Parliament, there's this section 9 that says what parliamentary privilege is. And so that became binding on the Westminster Parliament, because we have to understand that if you look at saying parliamentary privilege is not applicable, therefore I am going to take this member of parliament to court. The issue is that the Queen, every time we have a new opening of the House, or we have, so after an election, or if the House is prorogued, as we had a month ago or so. And so you see MPs and senators, they're just constantly standing up and bowing while the Governor General is reading the speech from the throne. And one of the things that the Speaker asks the Governor General is to grant the immunity, what we call the parliamentary privilege, to all members of Parliament and senators. And the Governor General accedes to that. So it's the same thing in the UK when the Queen or the King, whoever is on this throne, and they are opening their Parliament either after an election or after Parliament has been prorogued.
Right.
Every session of Parliament in a new Parliament, it's asked of the King or Queen, and they consent to it. We also then remember that the courts are the Crown's courts. So, for example, in criminal cases, as you are aware, criminal cases in the Supreme Court are brought on behalf of the Crown. So we see RV and then the name of the person who is the defendant. So because the privilege has been granted two parliamentarians at the beginning of each session of Parliament. And the courts are the Queen or the King's courts. Therefore, no one can bring a matter, whether it's a civil or a criminal matter, to those who the Crown has granted this legal immunity to. You can't bring it in their courts because they've already assented to giving the legal immunity.
Right.
So this 1729 that we talk about with our parliament, and we go back to 1689 with when the Bill of Rights came out. So parliamentary privilege, Article 9 says, and I have it just here, it says that the freedom of speech and debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not be impeached or questioned in any court or place outside of Parliament. And
That's
so,
alignment with what I know. Yeah.
yeah, so it's quite clear that the privilege is there. But unfortunately, in this case regarding Mr. Fitzgerald, I don't understand why the courts made the ruling that it does. But on a general point, it is still alive. We do have this freedom of communication, freedom of speech, all of these instruments that you have spoken about, and they do have the legal immunity. So that in essence is what the parliamentary privilege is all about.
Yeah. And so we ask these questions, folks, and we would like for you to ask what questions that you have or comments you would like to make. Just post them on the chat, and as I see them, I will bring them into the flow. But we also do this or ask these of the good gentleman Ben in here, because we found over the last, in particular, 40 to maybe 30 to 40 years, that our national narrative is really regressing. There's been some movement of recent, and hopefully that will be continuous, but we were being more destructive than we were building in our national narrative as a whole. Not just Parliament or we're talking across the whole board, whether it's the civic, the religious, wherever business. We seem to be going down and down and down and down. So we wanted to highlight these instruments so that people know what their intent was, and so we could try and get back to using the tools and the instruments as they are supposed to be used. And so one thing that I know always seemed to get mixed up, the band, is the issue of the official opposition. And then you have the other oppositions. But the official opposition, as I was taught at one point in time, is supposed to really be a part of government in practice. But when we look at that whole picture, tell us then, from this perspective of communicating and being responsible in our communications, what is the role of the official opposition?
And so democracy requires what we've talked about regarding this check and balance. We talked about it regarding the three different branches of government and how the Westminster system, or in our instance, the Constitution also has this check and balance that's built in. And so too is another check and balance built in regarding the executive branch. So we have the government, prime minister, cabinet ministers, and the prime minister is the leader of the party who can command the majority support of the members of parliament. So in other words, whoever's in government has to have the votes in order to pass laws and make them effective.
Right.
And so the leader of the party that can command the second amount of MPs, they then become the leader of His Majesty's official opposition. And so, but in our 50 years as an independent country, we've really just had two political parties as such. And so who is the leader? who becomes the government versus who becomes the opposition is quite clear. But in places like the UK, for example, they have several other minority or third parties. So there are other opposition parties, but in terms of the official opposition, it's the party that has the second amount of MPs. And so, from a practical perspective, we've seen, just getting into this session of Parliament, we've seen the official opposition be very, they're asking a lot of questions of the government. And that's a good thing for democracy, that the government must account to Parliament, and also that the official opposition must serve as a check and balance. In terms of the Public Accounts Committee, they have 3 members, while the government has 2 members. So that's another thing that they must scrutinize government legislation, as well as how the efficiency and effectiveness of how our branches of government open, how they operate. But there's only one thing that I see that the opposition isn't doing according to how the Westminster Convention requires them to do. So they're very active, and they're trying to hold the government to account, which that's their job. But the official opposition, they have a shadow cabinet. So just as we have the cabinet, the executive branch, who run the government, that our Westminster theory requires an official shadow cabinet, because at any given time, on any day when Parliament is in session, there may be a vote of no confidence in the government. And if there is a vote and the government cannot survive it, then now provisions are in place for, if the official opposition, they now have the majority of the votes. So whether, let's say, if we had some government backbenchers rebel against the government, or if we had a system where we had third parties and they have sufficient votes now that they are successful in their quest for a no confidence in the government, our constitution then provides that that official opposition, they now become the government. And so it's important then at any given moment that the system requires the opposition to have members of parliament who from day one are able to step up into now what would be cabinet positions, since they're shadowing the real cabinet or the official cabinet, for them to step up on any given day if a vote of no confidence passes for the government, or against the government rather, and for them to step up and assume government from day one. Now, the challenge that I have is the same Westminster conventions that require the government to operate a certain way. It also requires the shadow government to operate a certain way. So while Philip Davis is prime minister, the shadow prime minister is Michael Pintard. And then we can go down the list with the other government ministers versus who their shadow is. And so we have, so the same rules apply. And we've had, unfortunately, some MPs who have court cases. And so we've seen where one MP, when he was charged criminally, the prime minister asked for his resignation from the executive as a parliamentary secretary. That's the way that the system works. Now, he still has the presumption of innocence. And if when the court case is concluded, he is vindicated, there's nothing that prevents the prime minister from reinstating him to his position. And it's the same thing with from the opposition side, the official opposition side, of where we've had a member from them who have also a court case, but it hasn't happened. They've been charged, but Pintard hasn't followed what the Westminster Convention is. You can't force an MP to resign
Right. Right.
because, in essence, the contract is with them and the people who voted for
Right.
them.
Right.
So this is Seabreeze, for example, that I'm in, and you can have the member of parliament leave the party that they are aligned with, but they can't leave the people, nor
Right.
can the people leave them, since their contract is with the people.
Right.
They can cross the floor, they can become independent, but that contract that they have with the people, that is binding for the rest of that parliament. But in terms of the shadow cabinet, we had the opposition not require their member to resign. I think he has the shadow transport brief. So the theory is, let's say if next week there's a successful vote of no confidence in the
Right.
government, and the law now requires the official opposition, since they have backbench government support, and they now have the votes to become the new government, that member of parliament from the opposition, they cannot now become a government minister
Right.
since they have a case before the courts.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same thing, that they can't be in the shadow cabinet. But so this is something that I've spoken to on several times regarding if we are going to follow the Westminster rules and full the fullness of these rules. We have to do so without political party favor or
Right.
anything.
Right.
And the
Right.
rules are the rules, and they
Mm-hmm.
apply across the board.
Yeah. So, Monk Slim is saying here, why isn't the government teaching information like this very rarely to the average person? I would say beyond the average person, to those who sit in the House Assembly, because I wonder the way some of the behavior, whether they learn this information.
Yeah, I think, Dale, that we go back 50 years ago when
Mm-hmm.
we were now becoming an independent country. There were certain things culturally that this new government, who had broken the back of minority rule, so
Right.
we've achieved majority rule as a country, then they've broken the back of colonialism, and we're now getting ready to become this new independent country
Right.
who is going to join the United Nations and these other international organizations and establish our own right to self-determination, become members of all these international bodies. There was a feeling from government ministers that we have to put certain discriminatory things in the
Mm-hmm.
Constitution. One thing that we talk about would have been before this recent court ruling of single fathers
Right.
um, not being able to pass their Bahamian citizenship on to their children, was we don't want to ever get back to that place where we just came out of these rich foreign men marrying
Right.
Bahamian women, and
Right.
then they becoming the legislators and eventually taking back over the government. So certain discriminatory issues were put into the Constitution. But I think 50 years later, two generations later, we are big enough and we are established enough as a country that we can start to address some of these issues and eventually go towards the route of rectifying them. And
But
so my point with this is, I don't think there was much of an appetite 50 years ago to inform citizens of their rights.
yeah, but I mean, are we? I mean, 50 years is a very short space of time, right? I'm not for of arguing for it or against it at this point. On this point, I'm just asking this question. When the speaker the other day, they had a big rah-rah about the speaker making the statement to the fact that, listen, man, time us to move on from this type of narrative, and let's move on to a constructive narrative on the issue of the hedge, right? The BPL hedge issue.
Yes.
So, I mean, so are we there? You know, that's a question that I think a lot of people want to know. I mean, are we really advancing? We did a lot of things over the 50 years, but are we really advancing? Oops, we lost him. Hopefully he'll be back in 2 seconds. So folks, be sure to ask your questions, because I know that Ben McKinney is very eager to partake as much of this information that he has to be able to get your questions answered, and hopefully help us all understand the Westminster system a little better and to be able to be functional. One of the things with the people that we have is that we really supposed to be the ultimate persons who provide the guidance or the direction. I consider ourselves the people to be the board of the Bahamas. Just like we have um, a board of a company. So if we have the people being the board who elects everybody, and then the trickle down um, effect of accountability happens from there. But we have to take up our stance to be the people, and relinquish that application of power that we did when we became independent. Because back then we had the power, we got majority rule, as Ben mentioned, through the people's power. But then when we became independent, we relinquished it and just hand it over to the parliamentarians and say, okay, y'all run everything, and we can just sit back and enjoy the gravy kind of thing. But now we got to get it, be active again, involved in the governance of our country, which
Yeah,
might
Dale,
take some
just
structure.
one
Go ahead.
quick thing. I lost you for about a minute there because I had an incoming call that bounced me off. So if you can just repeat that point once again, that I have you now.
Yeah, I was just saying to persons to ask the questions that they had, because you were eager to get the information out to help us all understand the Westminster system better, and so that we could become more productive as citizens, who is the, I would consider to be like the board of a business, who's
Yes.
going to oversee everything, and it's really us who have the power, and after majority rule, we implemented or affected that power. But when we became independent, we decided to abdicate that power to the politicians or to the parliamentarians, and now we need to become more active again in
Right.
moving
Yeah.
the country forward. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're right, because the progress that we made in terms of, we had a two-tier country where women weren't allowed to vote,
Mm-hmm.
and men who had property were allowed to vote. And I think the election may be stretched for a whole week rather
Right.
than 10 hours in one day every 5 years, because people who had properties in different islands, they had to travel from island to island to
Right.
be able to cast their votes. So, what we've accomplished in terms of adult universal suffrage, what we've accomplished in terms of one man, one vote, all of these concepts in the 60s and up until the early 70s regarding our right to self determination and independence. I think you're right in terms of, unfortunately, the progress that we made, it stopped there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the feeling that, oh, we have a constitution now, we have a majority party that's in, and so the work is done. And my story that I recounted was, I didn't realize that the work wasn't done, and the work still needed to continue until I was put into an environment and saw other students from black and brown countries versus students from first world countries, and
Mm-hmm.
their work continues while ours didn't. So I think you're quite right with that point, that we need to identify that we still need to progress as a nation, And so the issue then becomes not if we do, but how do we do
Right.
it? And when do we do it? And so we talked about the importance of having educational and informative shows like this, but obviously there's more that needs to be done from a government perspective and for other people who are so minded like you are.
Mhm. Yeah, and so from our perspective here, it's something to think about. We say it in our opening and stuff, where we want to change the narrative because everything starts with thought and the narrative and so forth. And so that's why I really was happy that you chose to tackle this topic today. Because a lot of people, to be honest with you, a lot of people shied away from wanting to speak, and some of these have, I would say, two K's and a C behind their name. But it's people have reasons for why they do what they do. But um, so my thing is this: when we look at these scenarios, I mentioned parliament privilege, and I mentioned the opposition, and we can talk about public domain, because all of these spaces we have people communicating, but they're communicating what I consider to be reckless. And my grandmother used to say, you ain't got and you ain't gonna got because you can't keep what you got, kind of thing.
Mm,
So,
yeah.
um, um, how do we keep it? So, what do we need to change in this whole process before I get to Arthur Barnett's question? Um, so that we could become more responsible in dialogue, because public domain, my understanding is that's clearly defined, but people are doing whatever floats their boat and seem to be getting away with it. And then we get into the social media, which is another animal altogether at a different level of some of the things I see being circulated. I can't even hit forward or send to them because to me it just don't make no kind of sense as to why would you say that if you want to build something to make your life a better quality of life. It's going to come back around to haunt you at some point. Not you individually, maybe directly, but the whole cycle or everything going around is going to become like a tornado and then it's going to hit everybody. Yeah. What
Right.
do you have to say to that? Yeah.
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, the public domain issue that you have talked about, we have copyrights, we have patents, and the like, and they have certain protections for the persons who came up with it, their intellectual property as such. But information or music or other modes of communication, books, etc., that are in the public domain, they are free and they are available for all of us to use. So there are no issues regarding that. And they usually arise either before the applicable Copyright Act was brought into force or X amount of years after the author dies. And so tying that information that's in the public domain already, that anyone can use it. And this issue that you talked about now with social media, I think we are coming to terms with the power of social media. And we've seen the effects of it. The first election that was really fought on social media was 2017. And we've seen it used once again in 2021, the election. Because when we were boys growing up, I'm sure that you remember those days when you tuned into ZNS and mommy and daddy, they have their tally sheets. So they have the newspapers and it has all of the constituencies and the various polling divisions. And ZNS is calling out the information as the poll results come, and you are tallying it up as you go. And that's how you found out who won the election. But nowadays, with our communication and our information that's coming out there being more from social media rather than mainstream media, we kind of have a sense of the mood of the country. just by virtue of what is being said on social media. It's a form of communication that you spoke about. It's a form of people having the freedom to express themselves in a way that a generation ago others weren't able to use that mode.
Yeah. And so, and then also there are people who defined as being in people, places, and what have you as in the public domain, right? So you can't say or repeat what they say or say something about them because they are in considered maybe parliamentarians are one of them. At least I was told. So how does that work? So people understand why you could say something about one but not the other, and then tie it all into the big elephant in the room, which to me is the main media, which to me really needs to raise its hat in terms of being responsible. You have the opposition, the government, administration, and main media in particular, because social media to me is like the marketplace. I don't know if they could ever control that, but
Yeah.
or govern it per se.
Yeah,
Not
I,
necessarily
I don't
control, but
think
you know.
I don't think that they are able to, because you would have free speech advocates
Right.
who turn to whatever applicable constitution, whether it's ours and Article 23 talking about the freedom of expression, and they
Mm-hmm.
would do that, or in the U.S. Talking about their constitutional right to freedom of speech. So I don't think that it is something that the government is able to regulate. But tying this point with what we talked about earlier with
Mm-hmm.
respect to parliamentary privilege and members of parliament and senators having this legal immunity. In the UK, for example, they have used parliamentary privilege to deal with super injunctions, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an injunction, which all of us are aware of what it is. But there's this new concept now that's developed over the last few years of super injunctions, where not just is a party prevented from saying or doing something, but there are reporting restrictions on the media, and so it's not liked by those people who advocate for free speech.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're covering a trial, for example, and the media is prevented from even mentioning that the who the parties are
Right.
or what the issue is. So this whole concept of what we talk about of justice has to be not only be seen, not only be done, but seen
It's
to be
seen.
done. It,
Mm-hmm.
it now directly conflicts with that. And these super injunctions, they were primarily used by the rich so that they can cover up their misdeeds. So we
Mm-hmm.
have millionaire athletes who would use them sometimes to cover up marital indiscretions. If the newspapers want to report on something and they
Mm-hmm.
get a super injunction where we, the public, don't have that right to receive certain information. And why I bring it and tie it in with parliamentary privilege is we have had at least one instance in the UK Parliament where a member of Parliament has stood up, even though there's a court order preventing any reporting on the case. The member of parliament has stood up and used his parliamentary privilege to speak about this case that the court has disbanded on.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing can come out of it because, once again, they have that legal immunity.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so, but the immunity only relates to on the grounds of the parliament. Even though they're a member of parliament, if they were to say, whether mainstream media or social media, whatever they said in debates in the House of Assembly or in the Senate, they then
Mm-hmm.
subject themselves to the same defamation or criminal
Right.
charges that all of us are subject to.
Mm-hmm.
So parliamentary privilege can only be used in parliament, and otherwise, whatever is said, mainstream or social media, this now becomes they're subject to the same rules that we are.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and when we look at that whole picture, then, when we look at some of the headlines in some of these media um, papers and on the TV, etc., the headlines don't come close to matching what is the story. And then even sometimes the story or the quote isn't really a representation of what the person said. So how does all of this does the main media have a point of privilege also? I know we say that they have freedom to report, but
Yeah. So we have just in the Nassau Guardian today, there's a story in the Guardian on the front page regarding an attempt by the Long Island MP to place a gag on the media. And the
wow.
Supreme Court judge in that instance ruled, which would have perhaps been Friday or Monday, ruled against the MP. So you had this competing and conflicting issue between the media having the right to report the news and to impart information that the Constitution guarantees under the freedom of expression. And we have you have us, the public. We have the same rights to receive this information. But the conflicting thing then is there's another article in the Constitution which says that we have the right to a fair trial. And so Mr. Gibson, Adrian, had his lawyers argue that in order for him to receive a fair trial, the judge must place a gag order on the news media. So
Right.
they would be prevented from letting us, the public, know when he's going to court next. It's only a day after he's been in court, then would the order be lifted, and they're able to report that he was in court yesterday, and this is what happened in court. And in these instances, the court has to have a fine balance, and the balancing act is where does the balance of convenience lie between this constitutional right for the media to freely express themselves and for the public to freely receive this information from them versus the right to a fair trial, and we don't want to prejudice that right. And so the Guardian reports that the judge was able to find where the balance of convenience lied with respect to putting a caution on the media that whatever they report has to be accurate. And if they report something that isn't accurate, well, they would subject themselves to the courts intervening. And
Right.
then they also had a second caution in there regarding us on social media, where we too must only report on things that are accurate. So,
Right.
because remember, these criminal cases or any case that's before the courts is subject to the sub judice rules regarding you aren't allowed to comment on the evidence in the
Right.
case, since the person has a right to a fair trial. And if that continues, that would seriously prejudice their rights and may even lead to the judge declaring that it's impossible for them to get a fair trial, and therefore the proceedings have to be halted.
Right.
So it's a very serious issue, but we literally, the courts just dealt with this issue in the last day or two and found that that fine balance between these competing and conflicting issues.
Yeah, and I heard some people say in the corridors, etc., of some of the places that I traveled, that the court was overstepping its bounds. But I think we saw recently in the United States also, where the former president was making certain statements. I can't remember the details of what was being said, and the magistrate, the court judge said basically that no, he doesn't have the right to say all those different things that he was saying. Certain things had to happen. So there is leeway for, I guess that's what courts are for, is for judgments, but
Hmm.
so it's to happen. So it's not just us. So people who think that we, we say only in the Bahamas. We like to say that statement. Only in the Bahamas this happen. But
Oh, you're right.
that
Yeah.
that's I don't think that's so fair. I would say. But this issue though of the media should have a right to do, or has the right to the freedom of expression and reporting. But how they report, in terms of accuracy, are they
Exactly.
protected from just spinning around and changing the arrangement of the words to make it sound and mean something different? Can they actually do that? I mean, they could physically do it, but are they allowed or authorized to do that?
Yeah, well, all of us, so the media, and then us as individuals who might comment on social media.
Right.
So all of us are subject to the courts. And this same article that talks about the freedom of expression that we have, it
Mm-hmm.
then has in paragraph 2, it lays out the circumstances where those freedoms can be restricted, and one of the issues is for maintaining the integrity of the courts.
Okay.
So, in other words, we just can't say anything and say, see, look at this. I have freedom of expression.
Right.
You have to read the whole article to get it in its context. And it's quite clear in terms of the freedom that you have. It is what we call a limited right when we talk about our constitutional rights. It's a limited right. So we saw, for example, during the pandemic, where we were in a state of emergency, and Article 29, once the Governor General declared that we were in a state of emergency, there were certain constitutional rights that we had, that
Mm-hmm.
the Constitution clearly outlines in its various articles, that were suspended for the duration of the state of emergency,
Right.
including in this instance now, the freedom of expression. And then there was a penalty that was placed in some of these emergency orders, that if we breached certain provisions, that there would be this fine, um, or just this general penalty in doing that. So the point is that while we talk about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, it's not an absolute right. It's
Mm-hmm.
a limited right, and the right can be restricted, or in this instance, when we are at war or whether there's a state of emergency, it can be suspended for the duration of that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just one important point that we must consider, just in terms of how we're exercising that right and being responsible. So, the classic example that they give in law school is, just because you have a right to freedom of speech, once that freedom affects someone else,
Mm-hmm.
then you no longer have that right. So, if you're in a crowded movie theater and the lights are off, you're waiting for the movie to come on, and someone shouts, "Fire!"
Right.
uh, you don't have the right to say that, because other people now are affected by
Right.
your speech. There is
Mm-hmm.
going to be a mass rush towards the exit. People are going to get injured, etc. And so,
Mm-hmm.
whatever comes as a result of that, you would be liable for whatever injuries that those people suffer as a result of you purporting to exercise your freedom of speech.
Right.
So, with it just comes the responsibility.
Right. And I guess that's the key to everything right now when we talk about in all of these spaces, whether it's parliament, the oppositions, the media, etc. We need to be responsible in our actions. Now, the Justice Osadabe, the late Justice Osadabe, he always said to me, he said, "Happy, you have the right to exercise your rights as far as it doesn't interfere with other people exercising their rights."
Exactly.
So, mhm. So I never forget that because that hold me from getting in plenty trouble from other places. So that's good.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Arthur Barnett, um, thank you kindly for joining us also. But you had a question here earlier. I didn't want to break Ben's train of thought at the time. So I posted now, which is Ben is a maritime specialist that can the Bahamas do retain our position in the maritime world. What can we do, I guess?
Yeah.
Maybe
Now,
slightly different, but
yeah. So just digressing onto this
mhm.
maritime issue, as you're aware, we have one of the biggest ship registries in the world, one of the biggest international shipping registries.
Mhm.
At the time that I started working there, which would have been 20 years ago,
Okay.
2003, we were the third largest. But unfortunately, in the last 20 years, we have dropped down to number seven. So we've regressed over the last 20 years to the
Wow.
point that I think Mr. Barnett, who we worked together for a number of years while he was in
Mhm.
London, the point that he is making is how do we move back from number seven to number three, or certainly move up from our current ranking? And I've seen there's been some attempts by both governments to address this. There is a new Merchant Shipping Act that Parliament passed last year, but it hasn't been brought into force yet. And that act is more user friendly or more owner friendly. So I think just by virtue of changing our Merchant Shipping Act, a lot of the best practices have been incorporated into that new act. And I haven't heard anything about it being brought into force for this year. And we pretty much just have about a month and a half left in this year. So hopefully next year it will be. And by virtue of that, we can start to see things. I think also there are better linkages that needs to be made with our international shipping registry and our international business companies, our IBCs,
Mhm.
from the Registrar General. And so we have clients who are purchasing a ship and they are bringing that ship to be registered in the Bahamas. But instead of incorporating an IBC, a Bahamian International Business Company,
Mhm.
to put that ship ownership in, they go and incorporate a company in the Marshall Islands or Liberia, and then they bring the ship to the Bahamas.
Mhm.
So we say, why don't you just do this as a one stop shop? Because just as those other countries are known for their business and corporations, so too is the Bahamas.
Right.
And that ties our international shipping registry with our international business registry, and we can
Mhm.
have better linkages there. There's been some attempt to do that, but once again, it's not being as effective, or the customers haven't made that link. And so these are just two of the issues: a new Merchant Shipping Act that is more user friendly, which in and of itself should bring more business to us, and then better linkages between various government departments or agencies and how they link into each other.
Yes. Awesome. So we talked about or I mentioned earlier the issue of the new built environment, right? And I didn't say what it actually was, but um, when why am I? Why is that still on the screen? Why? What happened? Boom. So the new built environment is the political, economic, and social environment of our society formulated through intentional thought and action designed to create the greatest opportunity to build our highest quality of life for our citizens, residents, and those subscribing to and supporting the culture of the 242. and which will provide sustainability for generations to come. That's what Something to Think About believes in. And we believe in 5 pillars that will get us to $100 billion economy in 5 to 10 years. And so forth. Somebody on the show the other day said that number should be more like $1 trillion, and we could get to it easy. So what you were talking about is something that is very easily can fit into that model, and we would love for you to come back to talk in more detail on that, so that we, as a country, will be able to know more about some of the opportunities that we have, or should have, or can tap into, because that's one of the reasons why we have the show, is to, particularly our young people, to help them see what people are not talking about and expand their minds so that they could tap into some of these areas and maybe find opportunities to engage themselves, whether it's through a job or through entrepreneurship.
Yeah,
So
I totally support you on this initiative, because one thing that I've been asking of politicians is, we're seeing some very good news in the business section of the newspapers regarding our tourism. We've just had record numbers of tourists who have visited the Bahamas. We have surpassed 7 point whatever million the number
right,
is, and the government is looking to get past over 8 million before
right,
the end of the year. So that's great news. We have the economy pretty much being back, bouncing back post COVID. And we see these monthly central bank reports of how the economy now versus a year ago, of how much stronger and more robust it is. And practically every few weeks, we see a different government minister signing on to some development that is going to be X amount of hundreds of millions that are going to employ
right,
500 or 700 Bahamians. So the future looks bright and prosperous for us. But I come back to this one point, because I'm always concerned about whether we're doing a good job. It's not the central bank reporting it. It has its
right,
role regarding how strong the economy is, and that story needs to be told. But whether it reaches down to the average man and woman on the street, are
right,
we empowering them?
right,
So if we have a new hotel that's being built and will open in another year or two, what opportunities besides the hotel related jobs, what opportunities for small Bahamian entrepreneurs do we have built in? Can we
right,
have 5% or 10% that has been ring fenced for them? And then can we get those developers to buy into that?
right,
Do we need to provide some incentive to them? And if we do, obviously it would be worth it. But in too many instances, the rich foreigners are who are benefiting from all of these massive developments, and the big established Bahamian businesses. And the role for any small Bahamian is, we can give you a job. But
right,
if you see, we talk about on social media, there's this whole undercurrent now from Bahamians that we don't just want to work in the hotels, we
right,
want to now get into ownership.
right,
And so that type of empowerment is what I think, from the government's perspective, needs to be at the back of their mind regarding what percentage of this can we ring fence that Bahamians are now empowered, whether it's
right,
supplying goods, whether it's supplying services, and we can now make a whole other generation of millionaires.
right. Yeah. And on that point, before we go to the next step, what's the I keep saying to the different administrations, or these persons who are in the administrations, hopefully they would have grabbed it and run with it. that one of the things that we can do to help that break that economic stranglehold. Not that we want to touch anybody's money who already have the money, right? That's their money. They work hard for that. They should be able to keep that. But let's keep expanding the economy so more people can get it. And that is that when these new developments come about, one of the things we should put on the table is that it is mandatory that there's an IPO initially up to 60% offered to the public in the Bahamas. Now we know that the majority of people are not going to make up to 60% of the ownership of these companies, because some of these companies are huge and we don't have that kind of capital. But at least it gives people the opportunity to choose what they want to be a part of. And so they can also, that could be an avenue to help them build wealth. So that when they have that wealth, then now they could go back and do some of these entrepreneurial things that you talk about, other than have to keep going to these institutions that don't want to lend you money for other than for a car or not even a boat, but car and stuff that is superficial to me, right?
Yeah.
So great. But this has been awesome. You have actually done well because we're now 20 minutes past the hour that we had picked for you. But as usual, like we do for all our guests, before we thank you, we want to give you the opportunity. I know you said I asked you a lot of questions, but give you an opportunity to say anything you want to say to the public in reference to this subject or something related that
Well, it's just
we didn't
coming back
cover,
to,
right?
this theme that we have discussed in and out of with our discussion regarding empowering Bahamians.
Right,
As if we talk about opportunities that our parents and grandparents had in the first 50 years that they didn't particularly take up or they weren't aware of.
right,
This generation, me and you now, we are in the generation of decision makers. And the decisions that we make on a business level, on a personal level, and on a national level, it has an impact on those Bahamians who are underage and who can't make decisions for
right.
themselves. So, in all that we do, we just need to keep that in mind that we do need to now not just live in the present, but also now make plans and preparations for the betterment of the next generation.
Yeah, and once we're making those stuff, we need to drop some of this tribalism that we have, right? Because the tribalism just is throwing everything out of whack, right? We need some level of continuity in order to get things done,
Yeah.
and so, right,
That's something that I say in some of these political groups when there are discussions regarding our national resources, how a Bahamian is going to benefit from that, the comparison with other countries. I say that we need to be honest in all of our conversations, and we need to try to stop scoring points politically,
right,
because while we are arguing politically, the months and the years are going, and we
right,
still haven't gotten anywhere by doing so. So these needs to be national debates, but we need to be open and honest and put the cards on the table and not try to score political points of this government didn't do that or this particular government did this, but if you vote for us, we'll do that. Once we're able to put those things aside and just come together as Bahamians and whatnot, we'd find out that we can all benefit because we're all have a vested interest in it. And so it can either empower us and improve public finances, or we could continue to score political debates and in the end not accomplish anything. So
right,
these are some of the practical um, views, or what we talk about paradigm shifts of doing things differently that not only has an impact now, but an impact now on the next generation and of
right.
bettering the Bahamas.
Yeah, and the younger generations, disease and the like, they're not even interested in any of that power play scoring points issue kind of thing, right? Because they some of them from the reset generation, and when they in the middle of the game and the game not working, they just hit reset and start the game over. But And some of them take it extremes and do it in life too, run around with guns and what have you. But Ben,
Right.
it's been a pleasure. Ben Hur, and some
Yeah.
people might know who Ben Hur is, but I call him that every so often because, it's small in stature, but he very, very mighty man. Lot of going on between those heirs of his that was going to help us build our country. We'd like to thank you on behalf of all our friends of Something to Think About for coming on the show and sharing with us these nuggets that I think really, really, really a lot of people need to dig into and have appreciation for, because it will help them understand why certain things happen in the political arena in particular, maybe in the courts also, if you don't understand it. So thank you kindly, thank you kindly, thank you kindly, and we'll look forward to working out a schedule when you could come back to talk about the maritime portion.
Okay, well, thank you once again for having me, and thank you, audience, for listening. And let's do our part in all things to empower Bahamians, both now and this next generation.
Okay, awesome. Don't go too far, but we'll be right back with you. So, folks, you've been watching Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles, and we're delighted that you came on to this end part. And if you found value in this, please, 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 please share. Hit the like button multiple thousand times. Make sure it stays lit. That's how Facebook and YouTube gets to know that you like it, and they will share it with your friends and network. So until next time, we have another provocative conversation to help enlighten our minds. We'll be right back next week.
Enjoyed the show? Then subscribe to us for more educational and inspirational content. Ring the bell so you never miss a show. Let's change the narrative 242